If you're new to Formula One, or perhaps just haven't gone in to the history of the sport going back to the archives in the 80s and 90s, you might be surprised to learn that the backmarker team Williams was once a dominant force in the sport. And in fact, they are still the second all-time constructors record holder, having 9 titles in their history. After entering the sport in 1977, it took them only 3 years to win their first constructors title. However, since 1997, their fortunes have gotten worse each year, and with the exception of 2014 and 2015, they have slipped further through the field and are now dead last in 2022. So the question I've been asking myself is that given this team was once a dominant force in the sport, where did everything go wrong? Why did McLaren, who had similar beginnings, continue to fight for those top spots as Williams fell through the order? And has F1 changed so much that this legendary team may never again be able to sit at the top step in the records? To answer these questions, we need to really delve into what brought them up and what brought them down. And we're going to do all of that, well, now. I'm trying to beat that guy from Better Ideas to 3 million subscribers to become the most popular bald man on YouTube. And no, I haven't checked if there's anyone else. So by hitting that subscribe button, you'll really help me out because he's currently 2 million ahead. So the Williams that we know today was actually Frank Williams' second run at a Formula One team, which came after him having issues and falling out with Walter Wolff, causing him to sell the original Frank Williams racing team to Wolff, which then went on to become Walter Wolff Racing. This time though, he decided to co-found the new Williams Grand Prix Engineering with an engineer called Patrick Head, and they started making all of the right moves. They ran as a customer team in 1977 using the March chassis. This was a great base for Patrick Head to sit back and figure out what was wrong with the March, and using this as a base to learn what was wrong, Patrick Head was able to use his supreme engineering skill to pile all of this knowledge into their first constructor's chassis, the FW06 in 1978. And as was normal at the time, a lot of the car parts in this FW06 were off the shelf. For example, the radiators were from a bog standard Volkswagen Golf. This was an incredibly different era in Formula One. Using off-the-shelf car parts was by the by and a normal practice for most of the teams outside of the large teams such as Ferrari, who were building cars anyway. The closest thing we have to this now are customer parts, where Haas and Aston, for example, buy a significant amount of parts from Ferrari and Mercedes respectively. Back in these days, anybody who had the money could buy a homologated F1 chassis, show up to any F1 race and try to qualify. And this is why qualifying in those days was so different. In fact, anyone could qualify, but only a certain amount of cars would actually take place in the Grand Prix. Therefore, just because you qualified on a Saturday didn't mean you'd race on a Sunday. This meant that the term constructors was very different back then. For example, when Williams ran a March car, they couldn't win the constructors title because the constructors points would actually go to the March team, because the constructor would actually be March. So it could have been, for example, a March Williams championship if they decided to partner together like many teams did. And a great example of just how different Formula One was at the time was that the FW06 that they pioneered in 1978 they used for the first 4 races of 1979 before bringing in their FW07. And even more interestingly, they sold one of their FW06 chassis to Giacomo Agostini, who then used this to enter the 1979 season, coming off the back of being an ace motorcycle racing driver. He subsequently then used the exact same chassis again for the 1980 season. The point of this short rant is simply to show you that Formula One really was a different beast in those days. And although we still do get pay drivers today, the term pay driver would have been very, very different back in those days, because if I had enough money, I could simply buy a chassis, show up at the Monaco Grand Prix and try to qualify. Anyways, more to the point, Williams was dead set on becoming a constructor and showing that a group of wily old engineers and someone with ambition could really take the fight to the likes of Ferrari. And in doing so, they knew the only way to take that fight was to become a full constructor and have control of their car and destiny in their hands. When Patrick Head started working on the FW07, he based it on the incredible Lotus 79, even using the same wind tunnel as Lotus in London at the time. In fact, it was so close to the Lotus that Patrick Wright from Lotus itself publicly announced that the FW07 was nothing more than a re-engineered, much stiffer Lotus. You see, ground effect had taken over in the 1970s and early 80s in Formula 1 after being pioneered by Lotus and Colin Chapman, who used this to generate massive amounts of downforce to dominant effect throughout the 70s. However, what they failed to see at Lotus was that Patrick Head actually understood ground effect more than even Chapman himself. Patrick Head, along with Frank Durney, had created a car that was so efficient that its skirts sealed the underfloor for the entirety of a lap around Silverstone. The chassis was so effective that instead of creating a new car for 1980, they simply improved the stiffness and suspension of the FW07 into the FW07B, and the car was now so efficient in creating the ground effect downforce, it could run without a front wing if needs be. It was just an incredibly efficient car. And although ground effects was starting to be outlawed by the FIA for various safety reasons, starting with banning moving skirts for 1981, Williams by this stage had gotten such a good engineering team together that it was about to become a dominant force in the 1980s. And they went on to win the 1980, 81, 86 and 87 Constructors' Championships, along with the 80, 82 and 87 Drivers' Championships. Engines, as you may be obviously aware, play a huge part in Formula 1. After losing Honda to McLaren in 1987, Williams had a couple of years of shopping engine suppliers and little luck in winning any championships. Meanwhile, between 1988 and 1991, McLaren had won every single Constructors' Championship with Honda. However, in 1989, Williams started a new relationship with Renault. This engine matched with their eyes on taking the championship fight back to McLaren, who had become the dominant force in the later part of the 1980s. There were two more ingredients needed though to give them another title: an incredible car designer and an incredible driver, and they would get both of them in Newey and Mansell for the 1992 season. Adrian Newey was an F1 car designer who had started with March in 1988 and proven himself to be one of the hottest properties in the paddock, designing a car so good for March, later becoming Leighton, that massively outperformed its budget. However, in 1990, he had a falling out with Leighton and was now wanted by every team on the grid, including the likes of Ferrari. Williams, though, literally in its DNA, was the perfect fit for Adrian Newey at the time. It had a massively, basically unlimited budget coming off its success throughout the early to mid 80s. And Patrick Head was willing to allow Newey the creative freedom that he needed, that Leighton had strangled from him, basically leading through accountancy. And on top of this, they had secured Mansell, who Newey absolutely loved. To put in perspective how quickly Newey had improved the team's car, by the mid-season of 1991, his FW14 was a match for the dominant McLaren car. If it wasn't for the early season reliability and Senna's incredible driving in the McLaren, they could have actually won that championship. They had literally created a dream team in Newey, Renault and Mansell. And the FW14B with Mansell at the helm would give them the dominance they needed for 1992. The Williams team, though, although switching drivers, managed to continue this dominance into the mid-90s. They lost the 1994 championship tragically due to the loss of Ayrton Senna, and some incredible yet controversial success from Michael Schumacher and Benetton in 1994 and 1995 that would have the anti-Verstappen element on F1 Twitter in absolute shock. But that's a topic too complex for a simple side note in this video. At the end of 1997, Williams' dominance would once again come to an end as Renault left F1 for the second time and Newey was poached by McLaren, who were back on the rise once again after obtaining an incredible new partnership with Mercedes. McLaren would go on to have a decade-long fight with Ferrari, while Williams would slip further and further down the F1 ladder. So this gives us a great idea of what went right. It was a great mix of incredible engines, great engineers, and creative freedom. This led to them having great cars, which then in turn led to them having great drivers. I mean, Senna was so impressed by the Williams of 1992 that he literally offered to drive for free. So what went wrong? Well, one element is losing engines. This had a direct knock-on effect for the team. The loss of Renault engines and the rising success of McLaren with Mercedes meant that McLaren not only didn't have the right engine in the back, but also would start losing funding as McLaren started dominating. And this left them open to attack, where teams could poach not only their best designers, but then their best drivers. And it also didn't help that Newey was easily poached after Patrick Head and Frank Williams made some driver decisions without telling him, something that was explicitly in his contract. And Williams couldn't have lost Newey at a worse time. F1 was changing in a big way. Ecclestone had turned it into such a massive spectacle that it was starting to entice some of the world's biggest car companies. F1 had always been an expensive sport. However, now being at the front of F1 was a monumentally expensive endeavour. To put this in context, McLaren had now garnered an incredible relationship with Mercedes, meaning it had the power unit, the driver, on top of having gained Newey. Ferrari had now finally got themselves back on track with a great technical setup and bringing in Ross Brawn along with an amazing driver in Michael Schumacher to drive their creations. And Renault had set their sights big time to come back into the sport, and instead of supplying engines this time, they had bought Benetton and were ready to go on a run of success with Flavio Briatore at the helm. On top of this, the likes of Honda and Toyota would enter the sport, and Williams needed a solid engine, not just the reused Renault engines they had been repurposing in the last 2 years. So Williams, though, luckily did manage to solve one of their issues and get a BMW engine in the back. You see, BMW were looking to come into the sport and put the fight to their biggest competitor in Mercedes. But this is where things started to fall apart, because even though Williams was able to gain that BMW in the back of their car, what was at various times throughout the next 5 years the most powerful engine on the grid, they never managed to find someone who could lead their chassis in the same technical direction that Newey had been able to for the better part of a decade. And with the chassis not living up to the expectations of BMW, and even though in 2002 and 2003 they did have some serious fights with Ferrari, it left BMW wanting more. And BMW decided to take full control of their destiny by going all in with the Sauber team. So once again, at the end of 2005, like what had happened with Renault in 97 and Honda in 87, they once again lost the powertrain at the back of their car, a vital element to success. And this put Williams on an engine roundabout, switching between Cosworth, Renault, Toyota, and back to Cosworth before finally going to Mercedes in 2014. As they had become less competitive while they tried to figure this all out, they also lost sponsors and were falling further and further behind in terms of facilities because they just didn't have the funding. And as this happens, they then lose drivers and the competitive staff they need to the bigger teams who are winning, including their old arch nemesis, McLaren. Williams finished third in both 2014 and 2015, but this was primarily due to the fact that Mercedes had built an absolute rocket that was destroying the rest of the grid. Once the other engines started to claw back on them, Williams simply fell further and further back as their chassis design was more and more exposed. By this point, the likes of Red Bull, Ferrari and Mercedes were spending $300 to $400 million a year, a figure that Williams just could not keep up with. as they struggle to spend even $80 million a year. And this brings me to the question. Now that Williams has a new owner with a larger wallet, Mercedes engines locked in until 2025, surely they can come back to the top of the grid, right? It's in their DNA. Well, no, because now there is an even bigger emphasis on Formula One teams given its growth in the past few years. And even though the cost cap by its nature will now bring the top teams down spending the same maximum, teams like Williams and Haas haven't even gotten close to reaching this cost cap. This means that the car is running behind already because their facilities are behind. This means the best staff will always go to the biggest teams. On top of this, Audi have now bought a controlling share in Sauber. Aston Martin has the Strolls pumping money into what was Racing Point, and the big teams are improving their facilities as facilities aren't covered under the cost cap, which makes absolutely no sense. Thus, I don't think Williams will be able to get back to the top unless it's at the expense of their name itself. It needs a company with almost unlimited resources to purchase it. Think Porsche or even potentially Andretti to get that funding and to rebuild those facilities. The problem is that buyers like this don't want to share their name with an organisation that hasn't been at the front in nearly 3 decades. They want their name to stand with something that means success, and Williams sadly no longer does. However, what does stand for success is that subscribe button below. Thanks for watching.